Hi, I'm Dr. CS. In this video, we're going to install and configure Git, create a GitHub account, configure GitHub on our local computers so that we can use remote repositories conveniently, and create our first repository. So here I'm at the drcs.codes website. If we go to Professional Python, for example, click on Getting Started, and then click on the Git link here for install and configure Git. We're going to follow these steps. I'm going to start out on macOS. Now, to install Git on macOS, the recommended approach is to use Homebrew. If you go to the Git website, you'll notice that the download link takes you to instructions for using Homebrew. As I explained before, whenever you're installing software from a particular vendor, it's good to use that vendor's recommended approach. Python provides an installer, so we used Python's installer. The Git maintainers recommend to use Brew if you are on Mac OS. So that's what we'll do for Mac. Homebrew is a package manager for Unix tools on Mac OS. It's similar to apt on Debian Linux distributions like Ubuntu or Yum on Fedora. So to install it, we need to execute this command line here. We'll copy that to the clipboard, then go to our terminal, and then simply paste that. Now, when we run that, it's going to ask us for our password. We'll enter the password, and then it'll finish installing Brew for us. I'm not going to do this because I just canceled that with Control-C. I'm not going to do this because I've already installed Homebrew. So once we have Git installed, we have some setup to do. The first thing to do is we need to tell Git who we are. So this first line here, we're going to tell Git what our username is. This is going to appear in Git commit messages. So we paste that in to the command line, customize our name. I'll just call myself Dr. CS here. Next, we give our email address. And this is actually how our Gits are going to be tracked in GitHub. And then finally, I think this is actually the default, but we'll configure a default editor to use for commit messages if we don't use the -m option to provide a commit message whenever we commit code to a Git repository. And then there are two more options here that just make working with remotes a bit smoother. I'm just going to copy both of these, paste them, and they'll both get executed. Now if I say git config -- list, it tells me all of the configuration options that we just set. Okay. Now that we have Git installed and configured on our computers, it's time to set up a GitHub account. Go to github.com, enter your email address, and sign up for GitHub. Now, I've already done this, so I'm going to go ahead and sign in. Go ahead and pause the video right now and do step 1 on the GitHub setup. Okay, now that you have a GitHub account, go to the top right corner, click on your profile picture, and then select Settings. Over on the left, under Access, you'll see SSH and GPG keys. Click on that. The first thing we're going to do is generate some SSH keys, and then and then save our public SSH key on our GitHub account so that we can use GitHub remote repositories without having to enter our username and password. So click on the link to generating SSH keys. I'm going to hold down Command on Mac or Control on Windows so that it opens in a different tab. So you want to do a few things. You might already have an SSH key, and if you already have an SSH key, then you probably know all this stuff already, and you can just use one of those keys. So I'm going to go straight to generating a new SSH key. Now I'm on Mac first, so I'll do this for the Mac. Now scroll down to here, open up a terminal, and paste this text. Make sure you enter the email address that you use to sign up with GitHub. So it's going to save this key in this .ssh directory under your home directory. Go ahead and accept the defaults and enter a passphrase. Now, this should be a long phrase that will be easy for you to remember, but hard for someone to guess. Now, if we go to our .ssh directory, we'll see that we have two new files. This is our private key, and this is our public key. We go back to GitHub's directions. The next thing that we need to do is start the SSH agent. Once we do that, the next thing to do on recent versions of macOS is to modify a file called config in your .ssh directory. And we need to add this stuff to it. So I'll go back to the command line. Now, there are a couple of ways you can do this. I'm going to go ahead and use PyCharm's light edit mode. So I'm in the my .ssh directory, and I'm going to launch PyCharm in light edit mode and create a file called config. Now I'm going to paste the text that I copied from GitHub, save it, and now I'm done. I can go ahead and quit PyCharm now, and if I do a listing, I can see that the config file is there. I look at its contents to make sure that it's as I expect it to be. The next step is to add your SSH key to the SSH agent. It's going to ask you for your for the passphrase that you entered when you created the key. All right, and now our public-private key pair is ready to go. Okay, you'll notice that you get a warning here that the -K and -A flags are deprecated and have been replaced. Now, if you get more than a warning and that's an actual error, then go down to this note here and replace -K with --Apple use keychain. All right. Now, when something is deprecated, that means it still works, but the option is going to be removed in a future version. All right, so this is just a warning for now. So this worked for me, but it might not work for you. You might actually get an error. And if you do, just come over here to the directions and substitute --Apple use keychain instead of -K, capital K. All right, the last thing to do is to add the new SSH key to your GitHub account. So we'll use our web browser since we don't have the GitHub CLI installed. And it's pretty simple. On a Mac, you basically want to copy the contents of your public key. So on a Mac, what this does is it copies the contents of this file to the clipboard. All right, so you can follow along with these directions if you want. I'll go ahead and return to my GitHub profile. Click on my... Now, in case you're not there, click on your profile and go to Settings. And under Access, go to SSH and GPG keys. And now we come over to the right under SSH keys and click on New SSH key. Now, I'm going to call this Horant because that's the name of my computer. And in here, I'm just going to paste. Now I add that SSH key. And now I'm ready to go. One last step is you can test your SSH connection by entering this in the command line. And what you should get. So you need to add that key. So go ahead and say yes to say continue connecting. So we are successfully authenticated, and now we're ready to create a repository on github.com, clone it to our local machine, and start using it. So back to our directions on drcs.codes. For creating a repository, while logged into GitHub, and now I'm going to go back to my GitHub page, in the upper right corner, there's a plus right next to your profile picture. Click on New Repository. Give the repository a name. We'll call this Python-coursework. You can make this public or private, whatever you want. The most important options are down here. First, add a README file. What this does is it causes an actual repository to be created on GitHub that you can clone on your local machine. And this is the easiest way to set up a repository for which you want to have a remote on GitHub and then a local copy of it on your machine. Go ahead and use a gitignore template for Python and then create the repository. And there it is. So here's our repository page for our Python coursework repository. Come up to the right and click on the green code button. You'll notice that SSH is going to be highlighted here already since I've set up an SSH key. You could also use SSH, HTTPS, or the GitHub CLI, but it's much easier to use SSH, and that's why we set that up in the first place. So click on the copy icon over here, and now we're going to clone this to our local machine. So go back to our command line. Okay, so I'm still in my SSH directory. So I'm going to say just cd and hit return to go back to my home directory. We need to create the parent directory where we want to put all of our GitHub clones. Now, you can do this however you want. The way I like to do it is I like to make a directory called VCS, and then I need the -p option. Actually, let me do it without -p, and then you'll see what happens. So I like to create a VCS directory for version control systems, and then a subdirectory, which is the location of, which is the server where the remote is stored, and then the username or organization name that the repository belongs to on the remote. Now, when I hit return, I'm going to get an error, no such file or directory, because if you don't include the -p option, MakeDear assumes that this directory already exists and then tries to create just this directory. I'm going to hit the up arrow to go back to the last thing in my shell history, add the -p option. I'm doing Control E to get back to the end of the line. That's not necessary, but I always do that. And the -p means create the whole path. So now I have the whole path. And I can change to that directory and then say git clone and then paste what we copied from GitHub. Now you'll see that I have a Python coursework subdirectory. If I go into that subdirectory, do ls-la for a full directory listing. There's the README file that was created by GitHub for us, the .gitignore file that was created by GitHub for us, and this .git directory is a directory that contains Git configuration. Every Git repository has one. So if you're in a directory that is the root directory of a Git project, you're going to see a .git subdirectory. And as you remember, if you just do a regular directory listing and you don't add the A option to list all things, then you won't see files that start with dots. In Unix, putting a dot in front of a file name is a way to hide it. Okay, now that we have a directory set up, let's go ahead and create a PyCharm project for it. Now, just to make things easy, I'm going to say charm space dot, since I'm already there. And I want to tell PyCharm to go ahead and trust projects that are subdirectories, that are in subdirectories of my VCS, github.com, Dr. CS codes directory. If we go to our project panel, go to the top and say Command N to create a new file. I'm going to create a Python file. I don't think it really matters. I'm going to put this in a subdirectory. I'm going to call it intro/hello.py. Now, whenever you create a new file in a PyCharm project, and that PyCharm project also happens to be a GitHub repository, then PyCharm is going to offer to add that file to Git for you. Now, I normally go ahead and do that, but I'm going to click cancel just so I can show you how to add that at the command line. Okay, print hello world, save it. Now we can run that with Control-Shift-R, and it runs. Or we can say open in terminal, and notice that in this terminal, I'm already in the intro subdirectory where my hello.py is located, and I can run it from there. Let's go to the terminal, separate program, and if you do an ls, you can see that the intro directory is there. And if we look at the contents of the intro directory, we see our hello.py file. Now, this hasn't been added to Git yet. And if we do a git status, Git tells us that. And it says that the idea subdirectory is not tracked and the intro subdirectory is not tracked. Now we're going to ignore this .idea directory for now. This is a subdirectory that's created by PyCharm to hold project-specific configuration and index files and so on. So we're going to ignore that for now, and then we're going to come back to it and add some things to our gitignore file so that we don't even see that anymore. But we need to add our intro/hello.py. So git add intro/hello.py. Now if I say git status, it says that we have a new file to be committed. Now when you add something in Git, it goes into a staging area first, and it's not actually in the repository yet. So in this way, if you have several files that you want to add in a single commit, you can go ahead and stage them and then do a single commit that includes all of those files. So now that I've added it, now I have some files in my staging area, namely just this one file. Let's go ahead and commit it. -m means commit message, and I'm going to call this just hello.py or add hello.py. And now we see that everything is committed, but our local main branch is ahead of origin main. Origin main is a remote that was set up for us by the fact that we cloned the repository that already existed on GitHub. If I say git remote, there is our origin remote. If I say git remote-v for verbose, we can see that our fetching and pushing Git URLs are already set up for us. That is the advantage to setting up our Git repository on GitHub first and then cloning it locally. We don't have to do the git remote commands to set up a GitHub repository as a remote. So at this point, we can say git push. And what I've done here is I've committed directly to main. Now we normally don't want to do that. Normally we want to create what's called a feature branch or a topic branch and then push that and then merge it into our main branch using what's called a pull request. And in future videos, when we go over some of the projects and things like that, I'll show you how that all works. But if we go back to our GitHub repository now, do a refresh, we'll see our last commit message, we'll see our intro subdirectory, and we'll see our hello.py. So as you can see, the contents of our remote repository on GitHub now match the contents of our repository locally. If I do a git status, of course we have this untracked directory, but our main branch is up to date with origin main. So what this means, for example, is that now that we have this remote repository, if our computer goes Tango uniform, totally unusable, then, and we have to start over with a clean disk, we can go back to GitHub and simply clone this repository on our new computer once we get it set up. And we don't lose our work. You can also use this approach to use several computers, and you can clone this repository on several different computers and keep everything synchronized. So we have this .idea directory and we want Git to ignore it. We don't want to see it in our Git status messages, and we don't want to accidentally add it to our repository. So the .idea directory, as I said, contains project-specific IntelliJ or PyCharm configuration and things like that. And sometimes when you're having problems with PyCharm or IntelliJ, the right approach to fix them is to actually wipe that entire directory out and let IntelliJ or PyCharm recreate it for you. So it's generally not a good idea to commit that to a Git repository. So we need to add that to our gitignore file. So if we go back to PyCharm and open up .gitignore, we can simply add .idea/, save that. Now if we go back to our command line and say git status again, we see that our gitignore file has been modified, but we don't see this untracked .idea subdirectory anymore, which is exactly what we want. So let's go ahead and add gitignore. It's in our staging area now. Go ahead and push it. Origin main, that's our GitHub copy of this repository, and there's nothing to commit working tree clean. That means that the files in this project root directory and subdirectories match what's in the Git repository. And now we're ready to use Git in GitHub.